25 years later, Millionaire shocked to find his ex-lover with a young man who looks exactly like him. Hook. Imagine waking up 25 years later, only to find your past staring back at you. But this time, it's not just your memories, it's your son. The shocking truth behind a millionaire's darkest secrets will leave you questioning everything. What happens when you finally face the consequences of your choices? Stay with us until the end to uncover the twist that no one saw coming. 25 years, a quarter century, yet he never forgot her. He thought about her sometimes, the memories of their love. But time moved on. The years had changed him, changed them both. He became a millionaire. She faded into the past, but now he was back in town for a business deal. He stepped out of his sleek car. The city streets felt familiar, yet distant. As he walked, he saw her. She was standing by the cafe, a young man beside her. His breath caught in his chest. She was older, yes, but there's something about her. She hadn't changed that much. And the young man, he was staring right at him. Something in his eyes, the exact same eyes, the same piercing blue, the same sharp jawline. A chill ran down his spine. He blinked. Maybe it was the light. Maybe he was imagining things. But the resemblance was undeniable. Was it possible? Could it be? No, it couldn't. He stepped closer, unsure of what to do. His heart raced. The young man looked at him again. This time his gaze didn't waver. The tension thickened. The woman glanced up. Her face froze. Then a slow smile crept across her lips. But it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was something else. A secret. A recognition. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. And then she spoke. Long time no see, Daniel. His name. She knew it. But he wasn't sure if he knew her anymore. Not like this. He stared at the young man. The resemblance was uncanny. He took a step back. His pulse quickened. Who is he? Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. Her smile widened. Your son, she said. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind spun. His heart stopped. Could it be true? Impossible. He had never, had he, his thoughts scattered. He had never, not once, not in all these years. But she was staring at him, waiting for a reaction. The young man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. A quiet, unsettling tension hung in the air. Impossible, Daniel muttered, almost to himself. The woman's smile faded into something colder. It's the truth, she said, her voice flat. Daniel's mind raced. This couldn't be real. He would have known. He would have remembered. He tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. His gaze flicked from the young man to her, and back again. The young man spoke then, his voice deep and calm. You left us, Daniel. His words were like daggers, sharp and deliberate. Daniel's heart stuttered. He couldn't breathe. The boy's voice, it was so familiar. It was almost as if it was his own. You never even knew, the young man continued, his face expressionless. Did you? Daniel's hands trembled. He shook his head, his mind struggling to process the impossible. No, I didn't. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. There's a lot you don't know, Daniel. Her words were cold, calculated. He had once loved her, but now, the chill between them felt like a wall. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to blur. The air thickened. He felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. How? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How is this possible? The woman's eyes darkened. You left me pregnant, Daniel. Remember? Her words cut through him like a blade. The past crashed into him in waves. The memories came rushing back. Memories he had buried long ago. The affair, the passion, the lies, the betrayal, the broken promises. But the child, the son, How could he not know? He staggered backward, his mind scrambling for something to hold on to. His breath came in shallow gasps. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt. How could I have forgotten? He whispered to himself, more in shock than in question. The young man's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer, his features hardening. You didn't forget, the young man said, voice low. You chose to forget. Daniel's pulse raced, the weight of the words sinking in. What did that mean? Had he known and pushed it away? The woman reached into her bag, pulling out a yellowed envelope. She handed it to Daniel, her fingers brushing his. A strange electric shock ran through him at the touch. This is for you, she said, her voice soft now, almost tender. Daniel hesitated, eyes flicking between her and the young man. But there was no choice. He opened the envelope. Inside, a stack of photos. Old photos. His heart slammed in his chest as he flipped through them. There, in every single one, was the young man. As a child. As a teenager. A smile that matched his own. But there was more. One photo was of him. Younger. Standing beside her. The woman. Their hands intertwined. The past. It was all here, staring him in the face. He stumbled back, the truth hitting him with full force. I don't remember this. The words were barely audible. The woman's expression didn't change. You never asked, she said quietly. Daniel's hands shook as he flipped through the photos. The undeniable evidence of his son, his flesh and blood. I never knew, Daniel murmured, his voice breaking. The young man took a step forward. You still don't, he said. You think it ends here? That you can walk away and pretend this doesn't matter? Daniel's breath quickened. The weight of years of mistakes, of lost time, of stolen moments, crushed him. The world around him seemed to shrink, and the air grew thick with guilt. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? The young man's face was emotionless. Do you want to know what else you don't know, Daniel? He asked. Daniel looked up, his eyes wide, bracing for more. The young man took a deep breath. There's more to the story. Much more. Daniel's stomach twisted. What was he talking about? The woman stepped in front of him, blocking his view of her son. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice a low whisper. And suddenly Daniel knew. This wasn't just about a lost child. This was something darker, something he couldn't escape. Daniel's heart raced, a storm of questions whirling in his mind. Just the beginning. His voice was barely a whisper. The woman's eyes locked onto his, dark and unreadable. You thought you could walk away, live your life, and forget us. Forget what you did. Her voice was soft, almost mournful, but there was no warmth in it. Only a coldness that froze the air around them. Daniel couldn't bring himself to speak. The weight of her words hung heavy in his chest. You don't understand, he muttered, shaking his head. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. The young man took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. You think that changes anything? The words struck like a whip, cutting into him. No, it doesn't, the woman said quietly. But it doesn't matter now, does it? She looked at her son, then back to Daniel. You've been living your life, pretending everything was fine. She took a step closer, and suddenly, the air felt suffocating. Daniel's skin prickled with a growing sense of dread. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice cracking. The young man smiled a cold, calculated smile. We don't want anything from you, Daniel. You've already given us what we need. Daniel felt his stomach churn. What are you talking about? The young man's eyes gleamed with something darker now. You think this is about forgiveness, don't you? His voice was low, almost cruel. Daniel took a step back, fear creeping up his spine. I never asked for forgiveness, he started, but the young man cut him off. No, you didn't. But that doesn't change the fact that you owe us. A shiver ran through Daniel. Owe them? For what? The woman's lips curled into a tight smile. Think of it as a debt you never knew you had. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. The world seemed to spin, the edges of his vision blurring. Debt. Daniel's voice was hoarse. The woman nodded. Yes, and you've been paying it every day of your life, Daniel. You just didn't know how. The young man stepped forward again, his presence looming over Daniel. There's a price for abandoning your own blood, he said. Daniel's knees felt weak. He couldn't breathe. What was happening? The woman's eyes never left him. You thought you could run away, but you can't escape your past. His thoughts scrambled, but none of it made sense. I don't understand. You will, the woman said softly. You will. And with that, Daniel realized he had only just begun to uncover the truth. The truth about what they'd been hiding all these years, and the truth about the price he would now have to pay. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, each beat thundering in his ears. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. You're saying this is some kind of punishment? His voice shook, words barely forming. The young man's eyes gleamed, a cold fire burning behind them. It's not about punishment, he said, voice flat, almost indifferent. It's about justice. Justice? Daniel's mind reeled. His legs wobbled beneath him. The world tilted, and for a moment, he felt as if he might fall. The woman stepped forward, her gaze sharp. Justice for what you took from us. What you stole. Stole? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had never stolen anything from them. Not deliberately. But the woman's eyes told a different story. You abandoned us, she whispered, each word like a dagger. We didn't ask for your money, Daniel. We didn't ask for anything. But you took it, she continued. You took everything. And we were left with nothing. Daniel staggered back, his head spinning. I didn't know, he gasped, shaking his head. I didn't know about him. About my son. The young man took a step closer, his voice now cold, final. That's the problem, isn't it? You never knew. Never cared enough to know. It's too late now. Daniel's chest tightened. The words felt like chains wrapping around him, pulling him down into the darkness. I didn't know, he repeated, the words tasting hollow. But now you do. The woman's voice was laced with something dark, something dangerous. You see, Daniel, that's the thing. You've always been able to walk away, haven't you? Pretend nothing ever happened. She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But not this time. The young man's gaze was relentless. You're not walking away from this. Not this time. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile curled into something more sinister. You'll see soon enough, she said softly. And when you do, you'll understand just how deep this debt goes. The young man's eyes were cold, calculating. You thought money could buy everything, he said, almost mocking. But it won't buy this. It won't buy your way out. Daniel felt something deep inside him twist, a knot of fear that had no name, but felt as real as the air he was breathing. The truth was clear now. He wasn't just facing the consequences of forgotten years. He was facing something much darker, something he had no control over. A truth buried in his past that was clawing its way to the surface. And no matter how much he wished to escape, it was already too late. The woman turned to leave, her footsteps slow and deliberate. But before she did, she looked back at him, her eyes colder than before. There's one more thing, Daniel, she said, voice barely above a whisper. You've already paid the price in ways you can't even imagine. The young man stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. Now you'll see just how much it's cost you. Daniel's legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the cold pavement, his mind a tangled mess of confusion and fear. His breath came in shallow gasps as he looked up at the woman and her son, standing just a few feet away. The woman didn't turn back. Her figure was a silhouette against the dimming light, her back to him, already moving toward the shadows. The young man lingered for a moment, his eyes never leaving Daniel. The silence between them felt suffocating, like a thick fog rolling in. Daniel could barely process the weight of her last words. "You've already paid the price." The words echoed in his mind, taunting him, gnawing at him. What did she mean? What had he already lost? The young man bent down slowly, his expression unreadable, as though he were studying Daniel like a specimen. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice cold but laced with a faint trace of pity. Daniel's throat tightened. "No," he gasped, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "I don't understand any of this." The young man's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You will soon enough." Daniel's eyes flicked back to the woman, now almost swallowed by the evening shadows. I need answers," he breathed. His voice was shaky, desperate. "Why now? Why after all this time? Why come back?" The young man looked at him with a strange expression, as if Daniel's questions were both expected and beneath him. "Because you need to face what you did, Daniel. What you thought you could bury." Daniel's stomach churned. "I didn't." The young man silenced him with a sharp glance. "No more lies." Daniel's pulse hammered in his temples. His mind felt as though it were on the brink of splitting apart. "What do you want from me?" Daniel whispered. The young man took a step back, his eyes never leaving Daniel's, the same cold gaze that had unsettled him from the moment they had locked eyes. "You want to fix it? Want to make it right?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter, almost mocking. Daniel's breath caught. The young man's lips parted in the faintest trace of a grin. "You can't, Daniel. It's too late." The words dropped like a bomb, reverberating in Daniel's chest. "Too late? What did that mean? What have I lost?" Daniel asked, the desperation creeping into his voice. The young man stood still for a moment, his face unreadable. "You already know," he said. Daniel's heart seemed to stop in his chest. The young man turned his back to him, as though dismissing him entirely, and took a few steps toward the fading figure of the woman. "You've lost everything. But it's not the life you think you've lived that you've lost." Daniel's mind raced, but no words came. He could only watch, paralyzed, as the two figures walked away into the growing darkness. The last thing Daniel heard was the faint, chilling sound of their footsteps fading into nothingness. And then silence. As the night swallowed them whole, a terrifying truth began to settle over him like a suffocating weight. He wasn't just facing the consequences of a long-forgotten mistake. He was facing a reckoning for something far darker, something he had never imagined, and yet had been part of all along. The silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly around him. Daniel could still hear their footsteps echoing in his mind. But now, they were gone, vanished into the shadows. The chill in the air crept under his skin, the weight of their departure leaving him cold and empty. He stared at the empty street, trying to process what had just happened. But the pieces wouldn't fit together. He wanted to scream, to call out, but his voice seemed trapped inside him, choked by the crushing realization that nothing was as it seemed. He was alone now, completely alone. Too late, the young man's words echoed in his head. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, willing the images of those cold eyes, those words, to disappear. But they didn't. They lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. He stood up, his knees weak, his body trembling. He had to get answers. He had to understand. But where could he go? What was left for him now? The world around him seemed suddenly unfamiliar, like a place he no longer belonged. With no plan, no direction, Daniel began to walk. His steps were aimless, but they carried him through the streets, deeper into the heart of the city. The neon lights flickered above him, casting eerie glows on the pavement, illuminating nothing. He passed a familiar street, the old diner, they used to visit. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was. Daniel's mind spun. He couldn't go back to the life he'd built. It was clear now that life was a lie. The truth was out there, hidden in places he hadn't even known to look, and it would find him whether he wanted it to or not. He stopped, suddenly struck by a thought. What if she was lying? No, she couldn't have been. There had been something about her, something cold and certain in her voice, in the way she had looked at him. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache begin to form. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to get away, to erase the past and all that had happened. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. The past had found him, and it wasn't going to let him go. He had to face it, and as much as he hated it, he had to face her. But how? Where would he even begin? The woman's words echoed again, slicing through his thoughts. You've already paid the price. The ground seemed to shift beneath him. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself. He felt dizzy, as though the world was slowly unraveling at the edges. And then, from the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A figure in the distance, moving quickly, a shadow, a silhouette. Was it them? Had they come back? He took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. As he moved closer, the figure grew clearer. And then a voice, a familiar voice, called out from the shadows. Daniel, it was her, the woman. And she wasn't alone. The young man stood beside her. And this time, he wasn't smiling. There was something different about him now. Something darker. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as the woman's eyes locked onto his. You're not going anywhere, she said softly. The air felt heavier, and Daniel knew with chilling certainty that there was no way out. The air around him thickened, heavy with an unspoken promise of something he couldn't outrun. The woman's eyes burned with an intensity that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He froze, rooted to the spot, as if his very body knew that this was the moment he had been dreading. Where are you taking me? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, but the tremor in it betrayed him. The young man's cold gaze swept over him, unblinking. Nowhere, he said, his voice eerily calm. It's not about where you're going, Daniel. It's about what you've done. The words sliced through him, each one sinking deeper than the last. The woman's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but it wasn't kind. You've spent years running, she said. Now you have to face the truth. No more lies. No more pretending it doesn't matter. Daniel's mind raced, but his feet felt as though they were made of stone. His past had finally caught up with him, and there was no escape. He thought of the photos, of the young man's eyes, so eerily familiar. His son. But how could this be real? Could it really be true? Why didn't you tell me? Daniel choked out, his chest tight. Why wait all this time? The woman's expression hardened, her gaze piercing. Why? She repeated. Because you didn't deserve to know. Her words struck like a physical blow. You left us, Daniel. You left me. You made sure we didn't exist to you. And now you think you deserve answers. The young man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You wanted to forget, he said, voice cold and steady. But you can't. Not anymore. Daniel staggered back, his breath coming in short bursts. The truth was too much to bear. Please, he whispered, but he wasn't sure who he was pleading with. The woman's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of something almost human in them, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You never asked, Daniel. You never cared enough to ask what happened to us. She reached into her coat and pulled out another photograph, holding it out to him. It was the same as the others, only this time it wasn't just the young man. It was a picture of them both, the woman and Daniel, long before any of this had happened. before everything had gone wrong. They were happy, in love, or so it seemed. But the smile on his face in the photograph now felt like a distant memory. "Do you see it now?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. Daniel took the photograph, his hands shaking. The image blurred as tears stung his eyes. "I didn't know," he said, the words barely escaping his lips. "You don't remember?" the young man asked, his voice biting. "Everything we've been through, everything I've suffered, all because of you." "I never knew," Daniel muttered again, his chest tight with the weight of his regret. The woman took a step closer, her face unreadable. "No, you didn't. But you can't run anymore." Her words hung in the air like a final warning. Daniel felt a sinking dread in his gut, the feeling that something was coming that he couldn't control. But as he opened his mouth to speak, to beg for answers, he heard a sound behind him. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Another man, taller, darker, and impossibly familiar. His heart skipped a beat as recognition hit him like a wave. It was him, another version of the young man. The same eyes, the same sharp features, but older, harder, as though time had worn away any trace of innocence. Who are you?" Daniel breathed, stumbling backward. The new man's lips curled into a smile, dangerous, knowing. "I'm the one who's been waiting," he said, voice cold as ice. Daniel's pulse quickened, a wave of horror crashing over him. Before he could speak, the woman's voice rang out. "This is where it all ends, Daniel. And where it all begins." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Daniel's blood ran cold. The truth was more twisted than he could have ever imagined, and there was no turning back now. Daniel's knees buckled beneath him as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. The figure before him, the older version of the young man, stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling familiarity. The air around them felt thick, suffocating. "Who are you?" Daniel repeated, his voice shaking, but louder this time. The man's smile didn't falter. "I'm the one who should have been here all along," he said, his voice low and almost mocking. Daniel's chest tightened, panic rising in his throat. But the woman, she was silent now, watching the exchange with a quiet intensity. "Don't you see?" the older man continued. "You've never truly known. You've never wanted to. You've always kept your eyes closed, running from what's real, from what's yours." The word stung, sinking deep into Daniel's soul. He glanced at the younger man, his son. The boy's face was a mirror image of the man now standing before him. A shiver of realization crawled up Daniel's spine. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was all connected. "You've been lying to yourself," the older man said. "You've known deep down, but you've chosen to forget." Daniel's breath hitched. Chosen? He couldn't comprehend what was happening. The woman stepped forward now, her eyes locked onto his, intense and unforgiving. "There are things in your past you've buried so deep, Daniel. Things you thought you could erase, but you can't run from them forever." The young man's words cut through the growing tension. "You never asked why I look like you, why I sound like you. You never wanted to know." Daniel's eyes flicked back to him. "Why?" He barely recognized his own voice, strained and desperate. The older man chuckled, dark amusement flashing in his eyes. "Because the truth isn't something you can stomach, Daniel. Not after all this time." His gaze turned to the woman, then back to Daniel. "Do you remember what you did all those years ago? What you thought you could walk away from?" Daniel's mind spun, the memory a blur of fragments. He could feel it, the pull of something he had tried so hard to forget. I don't... But then, the truth slammed into him, like a floodgate opening. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, and the child. The son he had abandoned without ever knowing. He staggered back, the pieces falling into place too fast for him to process. "You," he gasped, the weight of the revelation crushing him. The older man nodded, a look of grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Yes, Daniel, I am your son. And so is he." Daniel's mind shattered. 2 sons. The young man in front of him, his firstborn, the one he had forgotten, the one he had erased from his life, and the man standing beside him, the older version, the one who had come for him now. "I never knew," Daniel whispered again, his voice cracking, his legs giving out beneath him. The woman watched him, her expression unreadable, but there was something almost sorrowful in her eyes now. "You never wanted to know," she said softly, "and now you'll understand the cost of that choice." The younger man, his son, stepped forward again. "You've never had to pay the price, have you, Daniel? You've always run, always found a way to buy your way out. But you can't buy your way out of this." Daniel's chest tightened, his vision swimming. No, this can't be happening." But the older man's voice was unyielding, final. "You made your choices. You've been living with the consequences all these years." Daniel looked at the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. "Why now?" he begged. "Why bring me here? Why drag me back into this?" The woman's gaze softened for a brief moment, but it was fleeting. "Because you need to understand, Daniel. You need to face the consequences of your actions. We're not here for revenge. We're here for the truth, and you can't escape it anymore." The older man's face hardened. "And neither can you." The weight of their words suffocated him, and for the first time in his life, Daniel realized he couldn't outrun his past. Not anymore. The truth had found him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating, as Daniel stood frozen, unable to speak. The truth had hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him, pulling him under. There was no escaping it, no running away. The woman's eyes seemed to pierce right through him, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her gaze that hinted at a sorrow deeper than he had ever imagined. But the older man, his son, stood firm, his eyes hard with a cold determination. "Do you feel it?" the older man asked, his voice low and cutting. The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Daniel to face what was unfolding before him. He couldn't answer. He didn't know how. "Do you feel the weight of your choices?" the man repeated, his voice gaining an edge of anger now. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he couldn't find his voice. The young man, the one who resembled him so much, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You left us," he said softly, but there was an intensity behind the words that made them feel like a physical blow. "We didn't ask for any of this, Daniel. But you didn't care, did you? You didn't care that you abandoned us." Daniel's chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate right there. His knees trembled beneath him, but he refused to fall. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But then the older man spoke again, his tone almost a whisper now, the words heavy with finality. "It's too late to regret, Daniel. You've already made your choices, and now we've made ours." Daniel looked at him, his heart pounding, as the gravity of the situation settled in. What do you want from me?" he asked, the desperation creeping into his voice once more. The woman stepped closer, her eyes softening just a fraction. "Nothing," she said quietly. Daniel blinked, confused, his mind scrambling to understand. "You're not here for revenge?" he asked. She shook her head slowly, but her face was stern. "No, this isn't about revenge. It's about you facing the truth, about you realizing the cost of the choices you made all those years ago. And what does that cost me?" Daniel whispered. The young man smirked, a bitter, hollow smile that made Daniel's skin crawl. "You already paid," he said simply. The woman turned to him, her gaze hardening. "No, he hasn't. Not yet." Daniel's stomach dropped at her words. Not yet. A chill crept up his spine, and a sick feeling twisted in his gut. The older man stepped forward now, his presence looming over Daniel. "You will face what you did," he said, "but not in the way you think." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. The older man leaned in close, his breath cold against Daniel's ear. You'll understand soon enough. And just as quickly, he stepped back, leaving Daniel to stand in the eerie silence between them. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. The world felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't escape. But the woman's voice cut through the silence again. You've always had control, Daniel. You've always had a way of buying yourself out of trouble. She paused, her gaze unwavering. But not this time. Daniel's pulse raced, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. You can't escape this, the young man said softly. You've already been living with the consequences for years, and now you'll live with the truth. Daniel's eyes flicked between the three of them, his mind spinning. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But their eyes, cold, unyielding, told him there was no escape. The truth had already taken root in his soul, and there was no running from it. He was trapped in a web of his own making. As the woman and her sons turned to leave, Daniel felt the weight of their presence press against him, a constant reminder that the past could never truly be buried. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he couldn't. He had never fought for anything before, and now it was too late. The footsteps faded into the distance, but their voices echoed in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. You will face it, Daniel. The words rang out like a final verdict, leaving him paralyzed in the cold, empty street. As the night swallowed them whole, Daniel knew his reckoning had only just begun. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, as if it had swallowed the last shred of hope Daniel had ever held onto. His heart hammered in his chest, and he stood frozen in the middle of the street, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The footsteps had faded, but their presence lingered, like a weight pressing down on him. The silence around him felt deafening now, the world too still, too quiet. He had been left alone, abandoned once more, but this time it was different. This time, the silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of escape. Daniel's legs shook as he took a slow step forward, the cold air biting at his skin, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. What now? Where could he go? He felt like a man stranded in a desert, searching for a way out, but unable to see anything beyond the horizon. His thoughts circled back to the truth, the brutal, unforgiving truth that had been thrust upon him. The woman, the son, the betrayal. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was no escape. Not anymore. Suddenly, the sound of a car approaching broke the stillness, its headlights cutting through the dark, sharp and piercing. Daniel's pulse quickened, his instinct screaming at him to move, to flee. But his feet stayed rooted to the pavement. The car slowed as it neared him, the engine humming softly. It stopped just a few feet away, and for a moment, everything was still again. Then the door opened, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his features hidden in the shadows, but there was something about him that felt familiar. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This was different. This wasn't just some passerby. The man's eyes caught his, and for the briefest moment, Daniel felt like time had stopped. The stranger's gaze was intense, filled with a knowing, almost too knowing. Daniel, the man said, his voice deep and calm. The way he said his name sent a jolt of recognition through Daniel. He had heard that voice before. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking as he tried to make sense of the moment. The man stepped closer, his face coming into view. But even in the dim light, Daniel could tell he was no stranger. "I'm the one who's been watching." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Watching. He couldn't hide the confusion in his voice. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You think you're alone in all this, Daniel, but you're not. You're part of something much bigger than you understand." The man's words struck him like a blow, leaving him stunned, speechless. What do you mean? Daniel's voice trembled as he spoke, trying to keep his footing, his mind still racing. The stranger's eyes never left him, their depth unsettling. You're tangled in a web, Daniel. A web of lies, of secrets, of debts that go back further than you can imagine. Daniel took a shaky step back, his breath coming faster. You're not the only one with blood on their hands, the man continued, his tone dark and foreboding. What are you talking about? Daniel gasped. The man tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. You'll understand soon enough, he said, his voice cold and final. Just like the others, you'll have to face it. The truth always catches up. And before Daniel could respond, the man stepped back into the car, his movements quick and precise. The door slammed shut, and the car sped off into the night, leaving Daniel standing alone once again. The chill of the air seemed to intensify as the sound of the car faded into the distance, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. The world felt like it was closing in on him, each breath heavier than the last. He thought of the woman, the younger man, his son, and now this new figure, a part of something bigger? He was no longer sure who to trust or what to believe. But one thing was clear. The truth was out there, and it wasn't done with him yet. He had a debt to pay, and somehow he knew he wouldn't be able to escape it. Not this time. The night was silent again, but the weight of everything that had happened hung heavily in the air. Daniel looked up at the darkened sky, a sense of inevitability settling over him. The past was catching up, and there was no turning back. Daniel stood there, staring at the spot where the car had disappeared, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence around him felt suffocating, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something. But what? He was no longer sure. His mind raced with the stranger's words. You're part of something much bigger than you understand. What could that mean? What was he involved in that he hadn't even realized? The weight of it pressed down on him, and he felt dizzy, as though the ground itself might collapse beneath him. He couldn't remember a time when everything had felt so out of his control. All his life he had made decisions, steered his own path, built his empire. But now it was like he was caught in a storm, unable to escape the tide. Every choice he made seemed to lead him deeper into something darker, something more dangerous. And the more he thought about the woman, his sons, the more he realized how little he truly knew. They knew things about him, about his past, that he hadn't even begun to comprehend. And as much as he tried to deny it, a creeping suspicion grew within him. They were right. He had been running from the truth for too long. The truth had always been there, waiting for him to face it. But he had been too blind, too caught up in his own world to see it. Daniel stumbled backward, his mind spinning. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was going on before it was too late. With every step he took away from the spot where the car had vanished, the feeling of being hunted, trapped, only grew stronger. He had to confront this. He had to face the truth before it consumed him. But where could he go? Who could he turn to? His life, the one he had so carefully built, was falling apart in pieces. A sudden noise from behind him made him jump, his heart lurching in his chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with deliberate steps, their face hidden in the dark. Daniel instinctively took a step back, his instinct screaming at him to run. But the figure spoke before he could react. Looking for answers, Daniel? The voice was low, familiar. It was her, the woman. He turned slowly, his legs feeling like lead as he faced her. She stood there, her eyes cold and unreadable, her presence commanding, almost like she had been waiting for this moment. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman tilted her head slightly, a trace of sadness crossing her face. "Because you need to understand," she said quietly. "Understand what?" She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. Everything you've done, every choice you've made, it's all led you here. To this moment, to this truth, Daniel's heart raced as he tried to comprehend her words. You think you're in control, that you can fix this, that you can escape, she continued, her voice softer now. But you can't. Not anymore. Her words sent a cold chill through him. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening. You don't have to do this, he pleaded, but it came out more like a question than a statement. Her eyes softened for a moment, but only for a fleeting second. You can't undo what's already been done, Daniel. She turned, walking away, her movements slow and deliberate. You'll find out soon enough what happens next. The past never lets go. Not completely. With each step she took, the distance between them seemed to grow wider, the sense of inevitability suffocating him. Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of it all, but it was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The world was shifting around him, and he was powerless to stop it. He glanced down at his hands, suddenly aware of how they were trembling. A feeling of dread washed over him, something far worse than fear. This was the recognition of being utterly powerless. He had tried to outrun his past, but it had caught up to him, faster and stronger than he could have ever imagined. And now, standing alone in the middle of the street, Daniel knew there was no escaping what came next. The truth had already begun to unravel, and it was pulling him into the unknown. As he turned and walked into the darkness, the silence behind him felt like the calm before a storm. The storm was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. The streets stretched out before Daniel, the darkness swallowing him whole as he walked aimlessly. Every step felt like he was sinking deeper, lost in a maze of his own making. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, the past never lets go. Asterisk. He had thought he could outrun it. He had convinced himself that he was above the consequences. But now, in the dead of night, as his own breath caught in his chest, he understood how wrong he had been. The city around him was quiet, eerily so, like it was holding its breath along with him. Daniel's footsteps were the only sound, heavy and hollow in the silence. He could feel eyes on him, though no one was around. It was like the shadows were alive, watching, waiting. He shivered and quickened his pace, but the feeling of being trapped only grew. He needed to go back to where it all began, to confront the woman, to confront his sons, to understand what they wanted from him. But something held him back, a nagging feeling, like the air around him was thick with danger. The streetlights above flickered, casting strange, uneven shadows. Daniel paused, looking around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There it was again, the feeling of being watched. He turned, but the street behind him was empty. The dark seemed to stretch further, darker and more oppressive, as if it had come alive, closing in on him. Get a grip, he muttered under his breath, trying to steady himself. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. His heart raced again. Then there it was, a low hum, barely audible at first, like the sound of an engine in the distance. It grew louder, closer. He tensed, glancing around for a place to hide. But it was too late. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw headlights approaching. The car. The same car from earlier. The one that had vanished into the night. It was coming toward him, slow, deliberate, like it had been waiting for him to brake. The vehicle stopped right in front of him, the engine cutting off with an eerie finality. The door opened, but this time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped back, heart pounding, a cold sweat running down his back. But it wasn't the woman who emerged from the car. It was the older man, the one who had claimed to be his son, the one with eyes that mirrored his own. Daniel froze, his blood running cold. You're not going to get away, the man said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Daniel's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to stand tall. "I'm not running," he said, though his voice was hoarse. The man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "No, you never do," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice, but it was dark, like a storm waiting to break. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "I don't want any part of this," he said, the words coming out more as a plea than a statement. The man tilted his head, considering him. "You never wanted to, but you're already part of it. You always have been." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but the man raised his hand, stopping him. "Don't bother. The truth is already out there, and it's waiting for you." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Daniel's mind raced. What did he mean? What truth? The man's gaze shifted, glancing over Daniel's shoulder for just a moment. And in that instant, Daniel felt the air shift. A presence, colder than before, crept up behind him. Before he could turn, a voice, asterisk his own asterisk, spoke from the darkness. "Daniel." His breath caught in his throat, the sound so eerily familiar it sent a shock of fear through him. He spun around. There, emerging from the shadows, stood another figure, a younger version of himself, the one that looked almost identical to him, yet somehow felt wrong. It wasn't just the eyes, it was everything, the posture, the way he moved, the way he stared at Daniel. A mirror, but twisted. "You think you're the only one with blood on your hands, don't you?" the younger version said. Daniel's mind screamed, but he couldn't move. "Who are you?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The younger version smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You know who I am, Daniel." And then, with a voice that sent chills down his spine, the figure said, "I'm the one you left behind." Daniel's world started to collapse around him, the weight of the words sinking in. This wasn't just about his sons. This was about something much darker. And the truth was finally breaking through. The world around Daniel seemed to tilt on its axis, his mind spinning as he stared at the figure in front of him. The younger version of himself, a mirror, but twisted, stood there, eyes locked on his, filled with a quiet, unsettling knowing. "I'm the one you left behind," the figure repeated, the words heavy with accusation. Daniel could barely breathe, his chest tight, every instinct screaming at him to flee, to escape this nightmare that had somehow become his reality. But his feet remained frozen to the ground. The younger man's smile didn't waver, a chilling mockery of Daniel's own. "I know what you've done, Daniel," he said softly, each word like a sharp blade cutting through the air. "You can't outrun it. Not anymore." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. The younger version of him took a slow step forward, the air between them thick with tension. "You've always thought you could control everything. Your money, your life, your choices." The figure's voice dropped, lowering with quiet intensity. "But you can't control this. You never could." The words echoed in Daniel's mind, a cold truth sinking into his bones. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could ever escape. "I didn't leave anyone behind," Daniel said. But the words felt hollow, empty. The younger version tilted his head, the smile growing wider, more sinister. "You didn't want to know about us, did you? You thought you could pretend we weren't real, that you could wash your hands of everything and move on." The man's eyes flicked to the older figure, who was still standing just behind Daniel. "You've been running your entire life, Daniel, but you can't outrun what you've done." The truth hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled, his mind unraveling as the pieces of his past collided with his present. He thought he had buried it all, the lies, the betrayal. He thought he had moved past it. But now, standing face to face with the two figures, one younger, one older, he realized he was still trapped in the very web he had tried to escape. I don't understand," Daniel stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The younger version of him stepped closer, their faces now mere inches apart. "You don't have to understand, Daniel," he said, his voice cold and final. "You just have to face it. The words hung in the air, suffocating him. Suddenly the older man, his son, spoke, his tone dark and certain. "It's time, Daniel. It's time for you to accept the truth." Daniel's heart slammed against his chest, panic rising. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I can't. I didn't." But the older man's gaze was unyielding, his voice like steel. "You didn't want to know the truth, but it's here now. You have no choice." Daniel turned, his mind spinning, searching for some way out, some escape from the suffocating grip of reality that was closing in on him. But the darkness around him seemed to close tighter, a storm he couldn't outrun. "Look at us," the younger version said, his voice a low whisper. "You created this." Daniel's breath hitched, his throat tightening as the weight of those words crashed down on him. For the first time he saw it, asterisk the cost of his choice's star. The years of running, of pretending, of hiding behind his wealth and power. And now it had caught up to him. He had abandoned his sons. He had abandoned the truth. And now there was no going back. "No more lies," the younger man said, his tone like ice. "This is what you made." The realization hit Daniel like a slap, his legs buckling beneath him as the ground seemed to give way. His mind was reeling, but there was no escape. The truth was here, and it was too late. The older man stepped forward, his eyes unblinking. "You'll pay the price for what you've done. It's the only way." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words caught in his throat. He was drowning in his own guilt, in the suffocating weight of his past. "You've already paid," the older man said, his voice cold. "But now you'll face it." Daniel could only nod weakly, the words too heavy to say. In that moment he understood. There was no running, no hiding. The truth had always been waiting for him, buried beneath layers of lies and delusion. And now there was nowhere left to go but forward, to face what he had done, to face the sons he had abandoned, and to finally, at last, confront the truth. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but Daniel knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The air around Daniel grew colder, heavier, as if the world itself was pressing in on him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of everything he had tried to outrun. It was suffocating, choking the life out of him. The figures in front of him, his sons, his mirror image, his past, loomed like a dark cloud. He could barely breathe, the truth strangling him from every side. The younger version of himself stepped even closer, their faces inches apart now, their eyes locked in a silent battle that Daniel wasn't sure he could win. "You still don't get it, do you?" the younger man whispered, his voice low and venomous. Daniel could barely find the words. His throat was dry, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling uncontrollably at his sides. "I didn't want this," he finally managed to choke out, his voice weak, broken. "I didn't want any of this." The younger man's lips twisted into a cruel smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes, an emptiness that Daniel couldn't bear to look at. "You think you had a choice? You think you could walk away from everything you built, from what you left behind?" The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's head spun, his mind a blur of conflicting emotions, guilt, fear, regret. But something else, something darker, crept in, too. Anger. It burned inside him like a fire, hotter and more consuming than anything he had ever felt before. "Don't you dare judge me," Daniel snapped, his voice rising, the tremor in it now laced with fury. "You don't know what I went through. You don't understand the sacrifices I made." The younger man's face didn't change. "Sacrifices?" he asked quietly, his tone almost mocking. "Or were they excuses? Hiding behind your wealth, your success, to avoid facing the consequences of your actions?" Daniel staggered back, feeling like the ground beneath him was giving way. His heart pounded in his chest as the words cut into him, each one a reminder of everything he had failed to see. "I didn't abandon you," Daniel whispered, barely able to speak, his voice cracking. I thought I was doing what was best. I thought I was protecting you." The younger man stepped even closer, his eyes cold and unblinking. "No, Daniel," he said softly. "You were only protecting yourself." A sharp sting ran through Daniel's chest, like a knife cutting through flesh, raw and jagged. He gasped for air, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The truth had always been right in front of him, yet he had refused to see it. He had spent so many years hiding behind his decisions, his wealth, his success, that he never allowed himself to confront the real cost of his actions. He had protected himself, but in doing so, he had destroyed everything that mattered. "Why now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back now? Why confront me now?" The younger man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, watching Daniel, his expression unreadable. And then the older man, his son, spoke. His voice was cold and final, the words slicing through the tension like a blade. "It's not about the past, Daniel. It's about the future." Daniel's head spun. He couldn't keep up with the turns this conversation was taking. "The future," he repeated, trying to make sense of it. The older man nodded. "You're not the only one who's been living in the shadows of the choices you made. We've had to live with them too. But now it's time for you to face what's coming." Daniel felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. "What's coming? What are you talking about?" The younger man's lips twisted into a smile, but it was colder, more calculated now. "You've been living in a world of lies, Daniel," he said, his voice almost gentle now. "And now, the truth is catching up. Everything you've built, everything you've fought for, it's all crumbling. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a weight, a final verdict. He could feel the ground beneath him slipping, could hear the cracks forming, the walls closing in on him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, I can fix this. I can make it right." But the younger version of him only shook his head, slowly. "You can't fix it, Daniel. You never could. And now it's time for you to pay the price." The older man's eyes met Daniel's, and for the first time, Daniel saw something that stopped him cold. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something much deeper. It was resignation. "You've made your bed, Daniel," the older man said quietly, "and now you'll lie in it." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to do something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The silence grew, thick and suffocating, as the figures in front of him remained still, unwavering. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He was trapped. He had nowhere left to run. Daniel stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart racing in his chest, the weight of the words sinking deeper into his bones. He had nowhere left to run. The world around him felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against him, tighter and tighter, until he could hardly breathe. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence was oppressive, crushing. His mind was a blur, swirling with panic and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he lost control so completely? The younger version of him, standing so close, just watched him with those cold, piercing eyes. Eyes that saw everything, every mistake, every betrayal, every lie. Daniel felt his stomach twist into knots, the weight of the past and the present crashing together in one suffocating moment. "I didn't know," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." The younger man's expression didn't soften. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if pitying Daniel. "You were never doing the right thing, Daniel. You were always doing what was easiest for you, what protected you. And now look where it's brought you." The older man, his son, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, his gaze unwavering. "It's too late for apologies. Too late to pretend you don't know the consequences of your actions. The damage is done." Daniel's mind raced, but his thoughts felt like they were slipping away, like sand running through his fingers. He didn't know what to say, how to fix any of this. The truth was so much worse than he'd ever imagined. He had spent years convincing himself he was in control, that he was making the right choices. But now he saw it clearly. He had been living in a lie. I didn't want this for you, Daniel finally said, his voice hoarse, broken. I didn't want you to suffer because of me. The younger version of him stepped closer, his face now inches from Daniel's, their breaths mingling in the cold night air. You didn't care enough to see what you were doing. You couldn't even see what was happening to us. The words stung like a slap, but they were true. Daniel had been blind, so focused on his own success, his own survival, that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming in his family, in his relationships. He hadn't seen the destruction until it was already too late. Please, Daniel whispered, his eyes welling with tears, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The younger man stood in front of him, silent for a moment, before he spoke again, his voice steady, cold. It's too late for apologies. You've already chosen your path, and now we're left to deal with the aftermath. Daniel staggered back, his hands shaking, his chest tight with fear and regret. He had thought that all the years of building, of climbing, would somehow redeem him. But now, facing the consequences, he realized how hollow those victories were. They'd cost him everything. The older man, still standing behind him, spoke again, his voice as final as the closing of a tomb. You've lost everything, Daniel. You just don't know it yet. A cold dread washed over Daniel as the truth of those words settled in. He had thought he was building an empire, but all he had done was create a prison for himself. You were never the man you thought you were, the younger version of him said, his voice laced with bitterness. You've been running from the truth your whole life, but now you have to face it. Daniel turned, his legs weak, his chest tight. His vision blurred, but he couldn't escape. Not anymore. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. The world felt cold, indifferent to his suffering. He had built this life, this facade, and now it was all crumbling around him. As he looked into the eyes of the man who was once his son, Daniel knew that there was no fixing it, no way to undo the damage. There was no way out. You can't escape your past, the older man said, his voice soft but deadly. It will always find you. Daniel took a step back, his mind reeling, his body numb. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew deep down that he couldn't. The truth had caught up to him, and now he had to face it. He had to face the wreckage of his life. You've already lost, the younger man said, his voice low and haunting. Now you'll have to live with the consequences. Daniel felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He couldn't. The weight of everything was too much. And then, as if the world itself had exhaled, everything went silent. The figures in front of him remained, their presence an inescapable truth. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that the road ahead was one he could never return from. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on Daniel, suffocating him with its weight. He could barely think, his mind a blur of regret and fear. His body trembled, the cold night air biting into his skin. But it wasn't the chill that made him shiver. It was the crushing realization that there was no escaping what had been set into motion so long ago. He looked around, his gaze bouncing from the two figures before him to the empty street that stretched behind. The world felt impossibly still, as if time itself had stopped. You can't run from this, the younger version of him repeated, his voice now an unshakable force in Daniel's mind. The words weren't just an accusation. They were a verdict, final and irreversible. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening as the weight of those words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He turned his eyes away from the two men, searching desperately for an escape, for a way to undo everything. But there was nothing, no way out. The road behind him had closed. There was no turning back. "I never meant for this to happen," Daniel muttered, almost pleading, his voice cracking under the strain. He took a step forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I didn't think—" But the younger man interrupted him, his eyes hard and unblinking. "You never thought at all, Daniel. You lived your life as if your actions didn't have consequences, as if you could just buy your way out of anything. But now you're seeing the truth, aren't you?" Daniel's stomach churned, the bitter taste of reality sinking deep into his gut. He didn't have an answer. What could he say? "I tried," Daniel said, more to himself than to them. "I tried to make it right. I tried to be a good father. I thought if I gave you everything, money, success, security, if I gave you the world, you'd forgive me for everything else." The younger version's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You never gave us what we needed, Daniel. Not love, not honesty, not your time. All we wanted was you. But you were always somewhere else, always running. And now—" His voice trailed off, and Daniel saw the flicker of something else in his eyes. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was sorrow, an unbearable, painful sorrow that Daniel had caused. The older man stepped forward, his presence like a cold wind. "Now you have to face what you've done. The past isn't going to let you go. And neither are we." Daniel felt the ground beneath him tilt. His knees buckled, and for the first time, he felt truly helpless. There was no one to blame but himself. He had failed. Failed as a father. Failed as a man. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. The younger version of him looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing something in his mind. And then, without a word, he turned his back, walking toward the shadows. The older man followed, but before he disappeared into the darkness, he turned back, his eyes locked on Daniel. "You can't escape us, Daniel. Not now. Not ever." With that, they were gone, and Daniel was left alone. The night swallowed them whole, leaving him standing in the silence. The oppressive weight of the darkness around him felt almost physical, like the very air had turned against him. He stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The truth echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again like a mantra he couldn't escape. He had ruined everything, but as the cold night wrapped around him, a different thought began to creep into his mind. Maybe this was his punishment. Maybe this was the price he had to pay for all the years of running, of pretending. And deep down, Daniel knew one thing for sure. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniel stood frozen in the silence, his mind racing, but his body paralyzed. The cold air bit at his skin, but it barely registered. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat a reminder of how far he had fallen. The city, once so familiar, now seemed foreign and hostile. The streets felt endless, stretching into an abyss that mirrored the emptiness inside him. The truth was like a weight that dragged him under, suffocating him, drowning him in the consequences of his choices. He had tried to outrun it all, tried to bury the past, to leave behind the wreckage of his own making. But it had caught up with him. The ghosts of his mistakes weren't just memories, they were living, breathing nightmares now. And they weren't going anywhere. The silence around him was deafening. The night seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing him whole. He thought about what the younger version of him had said. Asterisk, you never thought at all, Daniel. Asterisk. He had been right. So right. Daniel had spent his life building walls, convincing himself that he could keep the past at bay, that with enough money, enough success, he could erase his sins. But no amount of wealth or power could shield him from the truth. His mind drifted back to those days, to the choices that had seemed so simple at the time, the lies he told himself, the lies he told everyone else. He thought he had been protecting them, but in the end, he had only been protecting himself, and it had cost him everything. A sharp pain pierced his chest as the weight of it all pressed down on him. His sons, his flesh and blood, had been left in the wake of his selfishness. His eyes stung as he thought of them, of their faces, of their lives. What had they become because of him? Because of the father he had been, or rather, the father he hadn't been? He wanted to scream, to curse the world for what had happened. But the words felt empty, hollow. Why now? He muttered to himself. Why come back now? But deep down he already knew the answer. It wasn't about timing. It was about reckoning. The shadows stretched longer, darker, as if closing in on him, pressing down with a weight he couldn't escape. He could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but it sounded far away, like he was no longer a part of the world around him. He was drifting, unmoored, untethered. Something shifted inside him, a small spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Resolve. It flickered weakly at first, but it grew stronger, fueled by the terror that had gripped him earlier. If he was to face this, if he was to face them, he couldn't run. He had to confront the consequences, no matter how unbearable they seemed. He took a shaky breath, standing up straighter, pushing past the suffocating fear that had consumed him moments before. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his mistakes. He had to do something about it. He had to fix it. He had to face his sons. Without thinking, he turned and walked toward the empty street, the night still heavy around him. His steps were slow at first, hesitant, unsure. But with each movement, he grew steadier. He couldn't let this defeat him. Not again. As he walked, the city seemed to watch him, the shadows stretching out longer, almost alive. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever was coming next would be worse than anything he had ever imagined. But it had to be faced. He couldn't keep running from the truth. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The past had been chasing him for too long, and now he was ready to stop running. Daniel's footsteps echoed through the empty street, each one louder than the last, as if the world around him was holding its breath. The weight of the past clung to him like a second skin, the darkness pressing in, suffocating him. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't afford to. The silence around him was oppressive, and for a moment, he wondered if he was moving forward or simply walking in circles. The weight of the truth felt like it was breaking him in half. But somewhere, deep inside, a flicker of determination began to rise. He had made his choices, and now he had to face them. There was no turning back. He couldn't hide behind his wealth, his status, his excuses anymore. The damage had been done, and now he had to stand in the ruins, face the consequences, and try to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. Hell, it might never be possible, but he had to try. He didn't know where they were now, where his sons were hiding, but something told him they were waiting, watching. He couldn't escape them, and maybe he didn't want to anymore. Maybe facing them was the only way he could finally find redemption, or at least some sense of peace. His heart raced in his chest, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. The last embers of his guilt, of his self-loathing, seemed to burn out, leaving behind something more powerful, a need for truth, for closure. As he rounded a corner, the shadows seemed to shift, taking on an almost tangible form. He felt their presence before he saw them, his sons, standing in the dark. This time, there was no anger in their eyes, no accusation, just the quiet understanding that this moment had come, whether he was ready for it or not. The younger man, the reflection of Daniel's past, stepped forward, his gaze steady. "It's time," he said softly, as if there was nothing left to say. Daniel stood still, his body trembling, but his soul strangely calm. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I failed you both. I don't know if I can fix it, but I'm here now." The silence between them stretched for what felt like eternity before the older man spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You can't fix the past, Daniel," he said quietly. but you can start fresh. We all can. Daniel felt something inside him shift, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of redemption. He didn't know if his sons would ever fully forgive him, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He had faced the truth, and now, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. Daniel stood in front of his sons, the silence between them heavier than any words could bear. He had thought the weight of the past was unbearable, but now, standing face to face with the people he had hurt the most, he realized it had been only a small fraction of what he truly owed them. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking ever so slightly, but his voice steady when he spoke. I can't take back what I did. I can't undo the years I wasted running from the truth. He paused, his throat tight as he fought to keep his composure. But I can be here now. For the first time in a long time, I'm finally here. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. The younger version of him, the reflection of his past mistakes, looked at him with eyes that seemed older than his years. There was no anger, no venom, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was where they had come to. The older man, his son, stepped forward, his face unreadable, but his eyes softer than they had been. You can't change the past, the older man said quietly, but you can choose to show up in the present. Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside him. For the first time in years, he felt the heavy burden of guilt begin to loosen. It wasn't gone, not by any means, but it wasn't choking him anymore. The air felt a little lighter. His sons didn't offer him forgiveness right away, but there was no malice in their gaze. It was an acceptance, a silent agreement that they could move forward, even if the past couldn't be erased. The younger version of him turned, his figure melding with the shadows as he began to walk away. It's not about fixing everything, Daniel, he said without looking back. It's about facing it. That's where healing begins. Daniel watched as they disappeared into the night, the weight of everything he had done still there, but now accompanied by something new, a fragile hope. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if his sons would ever truly forgive him. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt ready to face whatever came next. He had walked through the darkness, and now, the first light of dawn was beginning to break. And with it came the quiet promise of a new beginning.